Every empire believed it had more time, more resources, more control, more reasons why history would not apply to them. None of them collapsed because they expected it. They collapsed because the system stopped responding before anyone noticed. This story is not about a single nation. It is about a pattern that repeats when power grows faster than limits. And the most dangerous moment is when everything still appears normal. Before examining Spain, Britain, or the Soviet Union, it is necessary to understand what imperial collapse actually looks like in reality. Not in textbooks, not in simplified timelines, but in practice. Empires do not collapse because they lose a single war. They do not collapse because an enemy suddenly becomes stronger. And they almost never collapse at the moment people expect. Imperial collapse begins with economic exhaustion. It starts when a system expands beyond its ability to sustain itself. Military bases spread across continents. Security guarantees multiply. Wars are fought on several fronts. Political promises accumulate faster than resources can support them. At first, none of this appears dangerous. The currency still functions. The military still wins battles. The government still pays its bills. The appearance of strength remains intact. But underneath that surface, the structure begins to fail. Resources are no longer allocated toward productive growth. They are diverted toward maintenance of the system itself. Debt replaces surplus. Financial engineering replaces real output. The economy shifts from creation to preservation and eventually to consumption without replacement. At this stage, decline is almost invisible. Living standards feel stable. Markets remain confident. Institutions project control. This is why empires always believe they are different. The warning signs do not feel like warnings. They feel manageable. Then the acceleration begins. Allies quietly hedge. Trade partners search for alternatives. Rivals test boundaries. The reserve currency, once demanded everywhere, begins to lose its unique role. Capital that once flowed outward starts returning home. Advantages that once sustained global dominance transform into vulnerabilities. A global military footprint becomes an unbearable cost. Long-standing promises become obligations that can no longer be honored. What once symbolized power turns into a source of strain. This process is not theoretical. It is not ideological. It is mechanical. It happened to Spain. It happened to Britain. It happened to the Soviet Union. And in every case, the collapse followed the same internal logic. Overextension, misallocation, erosion, and finally, failure. With that mechanism in mind, we can now examine how the pattern unfolded for the first time, and why it became the blueprint that every empire after would unknowingly follow. The first time this pattern played out at a global scale was Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries. This was not a marginal power. This was the richest empire the world had ever seen. After Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, Spain gained access to something no empire before it had ever controlled: industrial-scale precious metals. Gold and silver mines in the Americas produced wealth on a scale that Europe had never experienced. By the mid-16th century, Spanish galleons were transporting hundreds of tons of silver back to Europe every single year. By 1600, annual silver shipments had doubled again. Spain did not just possess wealth. Spain controlled the money supply of Europe. The Spanish real became the de facto global reserve currency. Trade contracts, military payments, and international commerce revolved around Spanish silver. To the ruling class in Madrid, this appeared to confirm something dangerous. That money itself guaranteed power. This is where the pattern begins. Stage 1. Military overextension. Flush with wealth, Spain expanded aggressively. It fought the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. It waged prolonged wars against France and Italian states. It crushed Protestant revolts in the Netherlands. It battled England at sea. It maintained campaigns in the Philippines and across the Americas. By the late 16th century, Spain had military commitments on 4 continents simultaneously. The cost was enormous. Roughly half of Spain's total revenue went directly to military spending. Even that was not enough to meet its obligations. Stage 2. Currency debasement. Taxation could not cover the empire's expenses, so the crown turned to the same solution. Failing systems always choose. Spanish authorities began reducing the silver content of their coins. Copper was mixed in. Then more copper. The face value remained unchanged, but the intrinsic value collapsed. Merchants noticed immediately. Prices rose. Trust eroded. Inflation surged. The currency still circulated, but it no longer functioned as a reliable store of value. Stage 3. The debt spiral. To bridge the gap, Spain borrowed heavily from Italian and German bankers. By 1557, time 0.3s, less than 2 decades into King Philip II's reign, Spain declared bankruptcy. Then it did so again. And again. 4 sovereign defaults in 40 years. Each time, reforms were promised. Each time, spending resumed. Borrowing replaced discipline. Stage 4. Loss of productive capacity. This stage is often misunderstood. Spain collapsed, not because it lacked money, but because it had too much. Easy wealth destroyed incentives. Domestic manufacturing declined. Agriculture stagnated. Innovation disappeared. Spain imported food, ships, textiles, and finished goods instead of producing them. Gold and silver flowed into Spain and straight back out again. The empire became a conduit, not a creator. Stage 5. Social decay. As the economy weakened, crime rose, beggars filled the streets. Skilled workers emigrated. The most capable minds left for countries that were building instead of consuming. What remained was an economy dominated by bureaucracy, military payrolls, and religious institutions, none of which generated new wealth. By the mid-17th century, Spain began losing territory. Portugal broke away. The Netherlands were lost. The empire still existed on maps, but it was economically hollow. Within less than a century, the world's first global superpower had become a secondary state, and it never recovered. Time 0.5s. This was not an accident. It was a sequence, and once it had played out, it became the blueprint for everything that followed. 3 centuries after Spain, the same pattern reappeared. This time inside the most sophisticated empire the world had ever known. At its peak in the early 20th century, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land surface and ruled over hundreds of millions of people. Its navy dominated global trade routes. London was the financial centre of the world, and the pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Every major trade contract was priced in pounds. Central banks held British bonds. International settlements flowed through London. To British policymakers, this seemed like confirmation that their position was permanent. It was not. Stage 1. Military overextension. By 1900, Britain maintained military commitments across 6 continents. Time 0.5s, India, Africa, the Middle East, China, the Pacific, the Caribbean, all required defense. The empire was already expensive to sustain before the First Global War even began. When World War I erupted in 1914, Britain faced a defining choice: remain neutral and preserve financial stability, or intervene and risk the empire's balance sheet. Britain chose to fight. The war cost over $40 billion at the time, roughly $1 trillion in today's terms. To pay for it, Britain borrowed heavily, primarily from the United States. By the end of the war, the world's largest creditor had quietly become the world's largest debtor. Stage 2. Currency strain and debasement. The pound was supposed to be backed by gold. But during the war, Britain shipped massive amounts of gold abroad to pay for weapons, food, and supplies. By 1920, its gold reserves had been cut in half. Despite this, Britain attempted to restore the pound to its pre-war value. In 1925, it returned to the gold standard at the old exchange rate. The result was catastrophic. The pound was massively overvalued. British exports became uncompetitive. Manufacturing collapsed. Unemployment soared. To defend the currency, interest rates were kept high, crushing the domestic economy. By 1931, the illusion broke. Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound immediately lost a quarter of its value. The global reserve currency had admitted it could not keep its promises. Stage 3. Debt entrenchment. Britain never escaped its World War I obligations before World War II arrived. The Second War added another $120 billion in costs. More borrowing followed. By 1945, Britain owed the United States and Canada more than the value of its entire annual economic output. The wars were won. The empire was not. Stage 4. Loss of empire. Financial exhaustion made global control impossible. In 1947, Britain relinquished India, the crown jewel that had underwritten imperial power for 2 centuries. Over the next 2 decades, the rest of the empire unraveled. Time 0.5s, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, all gone. Stage 5. Currency decline. The pound's status never recovered. Over the decades that followed, its value steadily eroded. What had once been the backbone of global finance became a regional currency. Britain retained symbols of influence, a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, nuclear weapons, a special relationship with the United States. But the underlying reality was clear. The empire was finished. Britain did not collapse overnight, but it never returned. And once again, the pattern proved that reserve currency status does not prevent decline. It merely delays recognition. With Britain, the blueprint repeated almost perfectly. And the next example would demonstrate something even more unsettling. Collapse does not always take centuries. The Soviet Union represents the most compressed version of this pattern. Proof that imperial collapse does not always unfold over centuries. Sometimes, it accelerates violently. After World War II, the USSR emerged as one of 2 global superpowers. It possessed nuclear weapons, a massive standing army, ideological reach across continents, and satellite states stretching from Eastern Europe into Central Asia. Soviet leadership believed history was on their side. Communism, they claimed, would eventually outproduce and outlast capitalism. Beneath the surface, the system was already failing. Stage 1. Military overextension. To compete with the United States, the Soviet Union devoted between 15 and 20% of its entire economic output to the military. This was not a temporary surge. It was a permanent commitment. Tanks, missiles, troops, submarines, nuclear arsenals, all had to be maintained continuously. At the same time, the USSR financed and supplied allied regimes across the globe. Afghanistan, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, Syria, Angola, Ethiopia. Wherever American influence appeared, Soviet resources followed. The strategic footprint expanded far beyond what the underlying economy could support. Stage 2. Economic stagnation. By the 1970s, Soviet economic growth had stalled. Central planning suppressed innovation. Factories met quotas but produced unusable goods. Agriculture failed repeatedly. Despite possessing some of the most fertile land on Earth, the Soviet Union became dependent on imported grain. Oil exports masked the problem for a time. High energy prices generated foreign currency, allowing the system to limp forward. But nothing structural improved. Stage 3. Currency failure. The ruble was never a true international currency. It could not be freely exchanged. Even Soviet citizens did not trust it. When possible, dollars were hoarded. Foreign trade required payment in gold, oil, or hard currency because no one wanted rubles. When oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s, the illusion ended. Gold reserves dwindled. Real money disappeared. Stage 4. Loss of empire. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Within months, Eastern European states broke away. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany, decades of strategic depth vanished almost overnight. The Soviet government lacked both the funds and legitimacy to stop it. Stage 5. Total collapse. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. From the fall of the Berlin Wall to complete dissolution took roughly 900 days. There was no invasion, no decisive war. The military went unpaid. The government stopped functioning. The currency became worthless. A superpower armed with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons collapsed from internal economic failure alone. The sequence had played out again, faster, but unchanged. And with 3 completed examples, the pattern was no longer historical curiosity. It was a warning, because the same sequence was already unfolding once more. This time, in real time. With the pattern established, the final step is comparison, not speculation, not prediction. A direct stage-by-stage alignment. The United States is not approaching this sequence. It is already inside it. Stage 1. Military overextension. The United States maintains more than 750 military bases across roughly 80 countries. American troops are present in over 150 nations. Defense commitments span Europe through NATO, East Asia through Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, the Middle East, and multiple maritime choke points simultaneously. Annual military spending now exceeds $850 billion, more than the next 10 countries combined. Even at that level, readiness is declining. Equipment ages, recruitment falls, supply chains strain, strategic commitments exceed available capacity. If multiple flashpoints ignite at once, the system cannot respond everywhere. Overextension confirmed. Stage 2. Currency debasement. In 1971, the gold window was closed. The dollar became a pure fiat currency. Since 2000, the money supply has expanded dramatically. Since 2020 alone, more than $6 trillion have been created. The dollar has lost roughly 98% of its purchasing power since the end of gold convertibility. The mechanism differs from Spain's coin debasement, but the outcome is identical. Value is diluted. Trust erodes gradually. Debasement. Confirmed. Stage 3. Debt spiral. United States federal debt now exceeds $36 trillion, roughly 120% of gross domestic product. Interest payments approach $1 trillion per year, surpassing defense spending. Deficits persist even during economic expansion. Borrowing is used to service existing obligations. New debt pays interest on old debt. This is not emergency financing. It is structural dependence. Debt spiral. Confirmed. Stage 4. Loss of productive capacity. The American economy increasingly designs, finances, and consumes, but produces less. Manufacturing has been hollowed out. Time. 0.5s. Critical supply chains operate offshore. The country imports hundreds of billions more than it exports annually. Essential goods, pharmaceuticals, electronics, industrial components, even military materials rely on foreign production. Like Spain centuries earlier, wealth flows outward while dependence deepens. Productive erosion. Confirmed. Stage 5. Social decay. Institutional trust has collapsed. Crime rises. Homelessness expands. Drug overdoses claim tens of thousands of lives annually. Fertility rates fall. Political dysfunction prevents coherent reform. The system continues to function, but belief in it does not. Social decay confirmed. 5. Stages completed. The Soviet Union reached this point shortly before implosion. Britain reached it before irreversible decline. Spain lingered longer, but never escaped. The United States is now at the same position in the sequence. What remains are the final two stages, the ones that determine whether decline becomes collapse. The final stages of the pattern are the most dangerous, not because they are mysterious, but because they unfold quickly once they begin. Stage 6. Loss of reserve currency status. This stage does not announce itself with a single event. It begins quietly. Allies diversify reserves. Trade contracts shift currencies. Central banks accumulate gold instead of government debt. Bilateral agreements replace multilateral systems. These moves are rational. They are not ideological. They are responses to risk. As reliance on the dollar decreases, the surplus of dollars held abroad begins to return home. What was once absorbed by global demand floods the domestic system. Inflationary pressure rises. Financial stability weakens. The advantages of reserve currency status reverse. Early signals are already visible. Emerging economies explore alternatives. Energy trade experiments with non-dollar settlement. Strategic rivals reduce exposure. None of this collapses the system overnight, but it changes its direction. Stage 7. Collapse. This is not gradual decline. It is sudden failure. When reserve currency demand breaks and debt obligations can no longer be financed, confidence disappears. A currency crisis triggers a debt crisis. A debt crisis triggers a political crisis. Institutions freeze. Markets seize. Trust evaporates. History shows that once this stage begins, there is no controlled landing. The Soviet Union vanished in 900 days. Britain lost its empire within a generation. Spain unraveled over decades. But the end was the same. Collapse is not managed. It is endured. At this point, reform arrives too late. Adjustments that could have worked in earlier stages fail under the weight of accumulated constraints. Options narrow. Choices become reactive. The system enters survival mode. The pattern does not dictate exact dates. It dictates sequence, and sequence determines outcome. 3 empires followed this sequence in full: Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union. Each believed its situation was unique. Each believed its power structure was too advanced, too entrenched, too essential to fail. Each believed the rules applied to others, not to them. They were wrong every time. Exceptionalism does not interrupt structural limits. Technology does not erase fiscal math. Global influence does not neutralize debt. Reserve currency status does not override incentives. When an empire completes the early stages of the sequence, the later stages are no longer optional. The pattern is not ideological. It is mechanical. You cannot spend beyond productive capacity indefinitely. You cannot maintain global commitments without surplus. You cannot debase a currency without consequence. And you cannot complete stages 1 through 5 and then choose to stop. The only variable history allows is timing. Maybe the window is a decade. Maybe it is 5 years. Maybe it is less. But when stage 6 accelerates, stage 7 follows quickly. A currency crisis cascades into a debt crisis. A debt crisis fractures political legitimacy. What once felt permanent collapses faster than anyone expects. Empires do not end with drama. They end with disbelief. Spain became a memory. Britain became a museum. The Soviet Union became a footnote. Each left behind monuments, stories, and warnings ignored until it was too late. The answers are not hidden in the future. They are written clearly in the past. And the pattern has never broken itself. It only waits for the next system to repeat it.